Hello and welcome to this afternoon's webinar at OSG. My name is Leighton Quinton. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at OSG, and today's topic is understanding the drivers of compliance with COVID-19. So this is useful for anyone, trying to understand in more detail what might make people comply or not comply with COVID-related legislation and requirements. Webinar in total will last about 30 minutes in terms of the presentation, and will benefit anyone and everyone who's impacted, and will at the end include some clarity on how best to nudge different groups into compliance. So the protocols for the webinar are fairly simple. We'll have the questions and answers session at the end, but if there are any questions that occur to you as the panelists present, please do just feed them in at that time, and I'll review the questions at the end of the slides, and then we'll answer those questions when we get to the end. So please feel free to let us have your questions whenever they occur to you throughout the presentation. At the end, you'll receive a short survey and a follow-up email from this event, and we'd very much welcome your feedback on the usefulness of the webinar. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce today's speakers. So I have with me David Levine. Now, David particularly focuses on medical technology companies for OSG, and he helps them with innovation, pricing, and go-to-market strategies, amongst other things. David's been with us since 2013. And is a key senior member of the OSG team. Also, we have Vaibhav, another senior member of our team, an MBA graduate with more than 12 years experience in market research, with firms including Kantar, Genpact, and Absolute Data. And Vaibhav, vertical's slightly different. He works in CPG, retail, banking, medical devices and pharma as well, and automotive. And again, helping drive innovation, pricing, product launches, and customer segmentation. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, David, who'll tell us a little bit about OSG, and then take us straight into the COVID research. Thank you, David.
Great, thanks so much, Leighton. So yeah, for those not familiar, OSG, we really focus on motivation and behavior, and how motivation and the thinking behind action, it drives what you do on a day-to-day basis. And this is something that we typically apply to a lot of marketing concerns. So how do we develop products that are meaningful and address unmet needs for people? How do we communicate those benefits to customers? How do we acquire and retain customers? And one of those things that we think about as we think about achieving growth for our clients is patient compliance, because that's an area, a lever that is a behavior that can also, by understanding how it's motivated, can improve that, which improves the bottom line for many of our clients. When this whole COVID situation started, we recognized an opportunity to bring the approaches that we do for our pharma clients in particular to an understanding of how anyone can be better motivated to be more compliant. We saw very early on that this was an area where every one of us can have a positive impact in slowing the spread of the disease by some behavioral changes. And when we did this research, when we initiated it, it was really at that point when the country was pretty well aligned on the fact that this was a serious concern and that very serious steps would need to happen. This was kind of when we were initially getting our federal guidance around lockdowns, things like that, about what behaviors would need to happen, what changes would need to take place in order for us to flatten the curve, as the language has been. I think since that time, over time, there has been some exhaustion with those measures. We're looking to change some of those measures. And there has been an element of politics that has been brought in that wasn't as much the focus at this particular point when we were focusing and when we did that research. And I think it's important to keep in mind that our perspectives here are a public health perspective, that from the point of view of public health, there are behaviors that we know are valuable in keeping individuals safe and the health of the country safe, and that even as things begin to open up, those behaviors will be important. And by understanding what motivates people to have those behaviors, we can take small steps to improve those around us, and we have some thoughts on what the at a federal level we can continue to be doing for more systemic changes. So that's what we're focusing on today, is the motivation behind different reactions and how you think about compliance and what we can all do toward that end.
All right, so let's get to know this particular study a bit more. So what we did here is we did a survey with close to 400 respondents, so 387 to be exact, to really understand the motivations that drive their behavior. Right now, just to kind of uncover those motivations, this was done using one of our proprietary methodology, which has been developed at Stanford University, called AceMap. Before we get into more details on the study, the key reason why we use this particular methodology was it helps us, it allows us to kind of look at multiple motivations, or a very high number of attributes which we could test out. Could go up to 50, but in this case we didn't really need to test its limit, but we had 27. And more so that it's real time. It's a gamification version of it, and the nature of modeling is very individualistic. So at a very individual level, we know what motivations are important to what kind of people, and that leads us to kind of really understand different segments that exist based on these motivations. It could help us understand, what different unmet needs and white spaces are. So with that, getting into a little more detail about the study. So we started up with a very top-down approach. Now, this top-down approach was largely to kind of understand what are those key attributes that define a certain motivation for someone to comply with COVID guidelines. Now, these basically range from evidence, presence of evidence. It ranges from, financial support, looks at influencers, which could be your family members and friends, which could lead you to comply, looks at regulation aspect, the resources which are being available to you for you to kind of adhere to those guidelines, and as well as the social aspect, which, given the whole COVID situation, the situation demands a certain, restriction in terms of socialization. So those aspects were basically brought in terms of, what motivations could work. With that, let's do a little more deeper dive into the data.
And we're not going to look at a whole lot of data here. We just kind of want to illustrate what this data is that is the basis for what we're going to be talking about today. So this is the 27 things that we looked at using AceMap, and this is the basis of everything we're going to be looking at here. If we take everyone together, so as Vaibhav said, this is an individualistic approach. What we're looking at is the average of everyone we talk to. For every single individual, we understand with this approach how much more motivating each one of this list is to everything else. The way you read the data, 100 is average motivation, 177 is 77% more motivating than average, 78 is 22% less motivating. And when you bring it all together, this is what it looks like. And you can see fear is the #1 motivating factor overall. What's much more interesting, though, is to identify groups that are motivated similarly to one another and compare those groups to each other. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on. Obviously, this is a lot of data here, but you can see the way, if we just kind of look at the shape of things, you can see we have this fear #1 overall. There's actually a very fearful group that's driving that, versus another group that's skeptics, versus these other groups that have different motivations that are driving them. So we're not going to spend any more time looking at charts like this. If anyone's interested, we're happy to share this data. We're happy to have a detailed data conversation, let you get in and play with it. So don't hesitate to reach out to us if you're really interested in that. We just wanted to illustrate what is behind what we're going to be talking about here, which is really who are these archetypes of the motivation and what does it mean to think about them as we encounter these people in our day-to-day lives. So as you saw, there were 4 groups, and that biggest group here is those motivated by fear. That's the 38%. And we'll talk more about these in detail. We have those group that's motivated by fear. We have the contrast group, which actually looks similar to them demographically, that are really skeptical of the whole situation in the first place. Following that, we have those that are motivated by the day-to-day practicalities of their obligations that are now threatened or put on hold, the financial obligations that are threatened by this situation, and see compliance as a trade-off risk-benefit analysis of making ends meet. And finally, the group that's really looking for guidance, that is overwhelmed by the situation and all of its various impacts, and are looking for external help from family, from government, of how to get by on a day-to-day basis in that respect, how to be compliant, but also how to keep their lives going in a compliant fashion. So that's what we're going to be talking about today in some more detail, these 4 groups that we've identified.
So let's get into each of these groups separately. So as David said, these are archetypes, and they are largely defined based on the key motivations that they have in terms of complying with the COVID guidelines. And if you look at the first one, which is the fearful group, this is the one which is afraid, and fear is the motivation for them, to kind of comply. And the kind of fear that they are mostly aligned with is, fear to kind of infect themselves as well as their near ones, and fear of spreading the particular virus. So they want to protect the family, they want to protect themselves. Those are the ones which are, the key motivations, and that's one of the reasons why, you don't really need to push them to comply. They themselves are, self-motivated to kind of, comply with the lockdowns and comply with the social distancing norms.
Right, and absolutely. I think that's a lens we're thinking about here is not just what is motivating to people, but from an action point of view, how important is it to be thinking about their compliance? And in this case, this is a group that is going to be very motivated on their own. You can help them to be compliant in ways where they may have issues, but and provide information because they're interested in that information. But a lot of this group is going to be much more self-motivated than some of these other groups. In particular, our skeptic group. And this is a group that demographically is similar, where the other group skewed to an older population, which is more likely to be at risk. Interestingly, the skeptical group also skewed to that same older population to a similar degree. So in a objective perspective, equally likely to be at risk. This group was more likely to be single, divorced, separated, less likely to have that nuclear family unit around them. So that may be impacted. But again, these are motivational groups. So while we see these skews, they're not necessarily, you have other demographics in here as well. You have younger people, you have married people who are part of this group. But what's interesting about this group is the motivation that really comes to the top is this idea of evidence. Prove to me that that this matters, that this is dangerous, that my compliance will help, that that things are actually getting worse, and that it's not just the flu and we see this every year. And while the challenging thing with this group is while they prioritize in an exercise like this, it's about evidence, evidence, evidence. What we see in academic literature around cognitive dissonance is that when people have deeply held beliefs, which often these are very deeply seated beliefs about the world around them, presenting people with evidence often has the opposite effect. So even if you present really impactful evidence around this, many of them are likely to be more entrenched in their position. We see this in a lot of areas. For example, it's obviously a much more trivial situation, but if you think about flat earthers, which is something you can learn about on the internet. Presenting them with the factual evidence is unlikely to have an impact on that belief. That being said, there is a new article in the Lancet, the medical journal, that's a very compelling meta-analysis of 172 studies where they quantitatively look at the impact of specific distancing measures, about keeping distance, about masks, and about eyewear. And the evidence is compelling. So it doesn't hurt to arm yourself with some of these basic facts that the Lancet, which is a pretty credible resource, looked at 172 studies and found that I think it was something like you're 4 times more likely to catch the virus at less than 1 meter than at 1 meter, and another 2 times more likely at 2 meters, or 2 times less likely at 2 meters. And I think it was you're 2.5 times more likely to catch the virus if your eyes are not covered with goggles or PPE than if you are. So it doesn't hurt to have compelling evidence that you can present from a credible source to an individual like this. But don't waste your breath. Don't make yourself crazy, because the chances are the impact is likely to be small, if any. So I think when we think about nudging, when we think about prioritizing our energy and our efforts and our initiatives, an audience like this is one where on the margin, you're not likely to have as much of an impact. So it is not our highest priority for nudging. But again, evidence doesn't hurt. Bob, any thoughts on this group?
Yeah, I mean, they look more like, how smokers are, so we have enough evidence that, linking smoking to lung cancer. But, and I'm pretty sure across the world, if you look at different countries, you'll find different initiatives that government put in place, but they just don't tend to budge. So this is compelling evidence enough that, these skeptics exist all across the world. Yes. And there's no surprise that they do here as well. Right. So the third group, which is more financially concerned, these are the ones who have obligations. These are the ones who have certain liabilities, and that's what is basically motivating them, right? So these are the ones who have certain rent payments, certain liabilities, rent, mortgages, or certain loans which they would want to probably adhere to at a monthly basis, and these are the ones who are more worried about risk of the job or loss of income that they may come up with. So really for them, the motivation is more around the incentives. How can you ensure and convince them that this would not affect their day-to-day lives and would not affect them financially? So governments could really use nudges, like these to help them get more compliant, and as well as to kind of adhere to those guidelines which are being set. I think they are most likely to comply, along with the fearful group. Incentives and the support system is financial support system is what they primarily look for in terms of complying with the guidelines.
And I think there's some interesting aspects of this group. I think really it's not necessarily, while they did prioritize financial incentives and penalties in a way that the other groups didn't, the thing that really stands out is this ability to meet their ongoing obligations, their debt commitments, their mortgage, their rent, things like that. Their ability to keep going with what they need to do, even amid all of these challenges. And among those also separately is the goods and services that they need, keeping food on the table. So this is an area where the government in many ways has stepped in and has put in place programs that were really directly addressing this group in this way, that your ongoing obligations could be deferred, could be held off without penalty. And as those begin to roll back, this is a group that we would expect to start to slip and start to make choices that are maybe not ideal from the point of view of compliance overall, but are necessary from their point of view. So I think this is a group that really can benefit from support in a institutional way, but also on an individual basis, whether that's financial or with perspectives on meeting obligations in the most compliant possible way, and strategies to help with that. Our last group, and I think in talking about this and preparing this, the three of us all felt very akin to this audience. This is the overwhelmed group, that we recognize the importance of this situation, the severity of this situation, and are impacted by it in different ways, but are really looking for guidance for what to do, both from the point of view of what is safe, what are the right steps to take, how can we all behave, but also how can I get through my day, and how can I keep my kids, safe, entertained, learning, growing, while still doing a full-time job. And a lot of the Married with Kids group fell into this category. And it's interesting, the motivators here were influencers, the federal government, guidance from institutions, guidance from friends and family, even celebrities to some degree had some impact on this group, where everyone else put that way at the bottom. But in terms of the practical areas for support, a lot of it was how can I keep doing my job at home? How can I keep my kids entertained? What can I do to keep myself entertained if I'm not going to leave the house for 6 months? So here is another group where, particularly as they get strained in some of these other dimensions, may feel a need for a push. They may feel some guidance, need for guidance, need for encouragement. And another one where, on the margin, like the financially concerned group, you can have an impact from small nudges that may make a difference. Any thoughts, Vaibhav? Or?
No, I guess this is a group, as you said, we all can very much relate to, or we can see ourselves as part of this group as well. We're worried about kids at home, additional responsibilities. So there are examples where governments could really help. So I know in certain countries there are restrictions on everything. Certain other countries, they had certain categories, which is availability of maids, which was made as essential. So there's one thing less that you need to worry about. So which helps.
So thinking about these four groups, I think something that's really interesting, you saw 4 different groups that are motivated in very different ways. A lot of them have to do with the situation around them, their financial situation, their family situation, but it does cut across that this is really, it's about motivation. And those are just some of the indicators. Really what's driving these differences are the motivational factors behind it. But what's interesting is, despite the different motivations, everyone saw their duty. Each of these 4 groups ranked the importance of their duty to society as essentially equally important. So right at the same level. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that it's not that any of these groups is necessarily more selfish than any of the others, or more derelict in some way. They're just motivated in different ways. Everyone felt the same degree that my actions, to the extent that my actions have an impact of those around me, it's important for me to keep in mind. And I do find that aspect an encouraging perspective, is that no matter how skeptical or disbelieving of the situation, fundamentally, this group does prioritize the need to be considerate of those around them. And I think that that's an important lens. And then thinking, just as a reminder, each of these groups can be nudged. Maybe the fearful nudging is less important than it is providing them any kind of support you can to make sure that they have the capabilities. The skeptics, maybe you're not going to win them over, but it doesn't hurt to have those well-supported facts from trusted sources, trusted to them. A lot of skeptics may not be familiar with the Lancet or know what a meta-analysis is. Perfectly fair. The financial group, maybe it's more of a financial incentive or strategy or relief, debt relief in some way, or overwhelmed, just having some entertainment available, things like that. Maybe those are groups that on the margin those types of impacts will actually make more of a difference in terms of whether or not they choose to comply at any given moment. But each of them are motivated differently, and with that knowledge, we can help to encourage behavior, good behavior.
So now the big question is, we've looked at 4 distant segments based on their motivations and how they behave. So how can we how can a government reach out to all of them effectively, right? So this, I'm pretty sure people with a research background may be very familiar with this sort of answers, but the whole idea here is, what is that combination of efforts that need to be put in so that, it gives you the best result, right? Now, looking at that, clear guidance from the federal government or politicians is something, along with ensuring a lockdown of the community can definitely help them comply. I mean, there's no question about that. But beyond which, it is needs or motivations around availability or access to adequate goods or services. It is about protecting messaging, probably protecting the vulnerable within the family or within their near ones. As well as the financial aid, which David just talked about, which a government could really intervene with, and a lot of places governments have. Other ones which can really help you get maximum in terms of compliance from the population. So that's basically a sort of I wouldn't say it's the only answer, but one of those things which could be looked at to see what works well. So, okay, now the big question here is, we understand that, in terms of compliance, this whole study was, looking what could we do to kind of motivate compliance with the guidelines. But the bigger question is, okay, what are implications? Is this even relevant for consumer behavior? Yes, it is, because, if you kind of take these 4 motivation-based segments and you really put them into a purchase kind of a scenario, you have fearfuls who would comply, and they would easily comply with the guidelines. So they're not the one who are going out and who would go do the usual shopping, whether it's any CPG goods. They might find some alternates for their essentials, but those are the ones which are going to heavily reduce. And I think many categories across the globe have seen a drop in their usage, drop in their sales, drop in their product usage. So these are the groups which basically align very nicely to them. Skeptics are the ones, as we discussed enough about them, they are the ones who challenge everything. So they're probably the ones who are still going out and buying whatever they used to, in whatever manner that they used to. So they're the ones who would have probably not changed their behavior a lot. There might be some, but nothing much. Financially concerned are the ones, as we said, they could be financially affected. So that definitely puts pressure in terms of where do they spend, and it kind of puts a pressure in terms of their spending capabilities as well, right? And overwhelmed are basically the group which is ready to pay till the time they seek value, right? So those are the ones which can really go about, maybe even purchase more than what they were, because to be honest, they're sitting at home, there's nothing much to do, so they're looking for entertainment, they're looking for where they could spend their time with, and how more could they be kind of engaged, keeping themselves engaged, keeping their family engaged, kids, whoever they're living with. So they are very relevant even from a consumer behavior point of view, and that's where they basically triggered off a particular thought. Sorry, David, you wanted to add something before I move on to the next one?
Please. No. Thank you for your
Sure.
summary.
So, I mean, that's where we basically thought, we need to kind of understand what their individual category level motivations are. So we've initiated another work, which is live right now. We've started seeing certain results, and, they're not very different. So there are people who are afraid, who are not shopping enough. They're dropping their shopping frequency. They're dropping the quantity that they purchase. There are people who are basically undeterred, and doesn't matter. And those are the ones who are skeptics. They challenge everything. So this is something which we are doing, and the whole objective of this particular study that is currently being done and which is live is to identify these archetypes, but more from the category that we are tracking, and understand what archetypes exist, what are their motivations behind their purchase behavior, which COVID has led them into, and what motivations do really manufacturers and brands need to focus on to really act and strategize upon. So for more details, there is a link which is available on this deck. You could check out our website as well to kind of give you more details on that.
Okay, a few questions have come in for our speakers, so I'll just do them in pretty much the order that we've got them coming in. So one of the early questions was, did we look at any ethnographic or income information when we were looking at the different groups, and is there anything specific in relation to the skeptical group?
We collected a lot of that information and we looked at that. If we didn't highlight it here, it was because the differences between the segments weren't significant. So I could double check that. I mean, we kind of we're just using a rule of, well, not a rule of thumb. We were using a threshold for significance of what we were calling out. But there probably were directional skews across all the segments. Financial differences, race differences, other things, gender that we collected. There were a couple gender differences that we just didn't call out. But if you're interested in the specifics of that, we're happy to share the details of the other big mountain of data that's behind this that we didn't talk about.
Okay, thank you. Do the speakers think these segments will continue to exist for quite some time now, or do you think they'll become less prevalent as people embrace new norms and adapt to this new COVID world?
So what we find with AceMap data is that it represents very lasting attributes of the individual. I think there is the external factor of what's going on at the moment and the extent of the intensity that they're feeling these things, but they tend to reflect things that are more lasting about the individual. And we'll see that, we have repeated studies 5 years apart, 7 years apart, where there have been very large systemic changes in, say, a hospital system or the healthcare system. And we see the fundamental ideas and the structures and the groups that we find still exist, but they may present themselves in different ways. When things are more intense, more intensely focused, you tend to fall back into these patterns and tend to really think of really primary motivators in a very present way, whereas they may underlie some of your other decision making when we're not thinking about this anymore. We are, we're moving on to another topic. The world has changed. There's the underlying belief structure, motivational structure tends to still exist, but it may not be as something present and as visible as you would see otherwise. Vaibhav, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I agree, David. And AceMap, the way we kind of look at these motivations is you could look at. I mean, I'm borrowing something which we're doing from the consumer side of things. So there are a lot of motivations, and we've seen, even if you kind of look at a lot of these countries where the restrictions have been removed, people are free to go out, restaurants and malls have been opened up. You still do not see a large chunk of movement that used to be pre-COVID, right? And that's where you kind of tend to see a trend, and that these motivations which led to those differences are something which would stay, right? Until unless, I mean, to be honest, it's a paradigm shift, right, in all our lives. So until unless there's something new which is coming up, which is even worse than this, then, probably, I guess, yes, there is a longevity to it.
Thank you, Vaibhav. Okay. I'll kind of roll these two questions into one, just for brevity. more about the specifics, I think, of the study. So how was duty to society defined, and how did OSG define compliant behaviour when you know we went ahead with this study? How was the mechanics of that handled?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the compliant behavior part of things, we had a series of attitudinal questions around their relationship and perspectives and reactions around the conditions. And based on that, we did an analysis, a statistical analysis to group that way and to infer the likely behavior resulting from those data points. You don't typically want to ask people directly sensitive questions about areas where there are social norms that would prevent people from answering honestly. So we took a pretty standard academic approach there, adapted to this approach so that we could estimate the likely compliance as opposed to asking people outright, are you being compliant? How compliant are you being? In terms of the duty, let me just step back to that because I forget the way that was phrased. But I was referring to, it was right around here. It is my duty as a citizen, which may have actually, this may be slightly abbreviated, as you can see elsewhere for this presentation, but the sense of duty as a citizen. So that's specifically what we were referring to in that discussion of, that was, and you can actually see it, we might as well take a quick look. Right here, you can see it's right around that same 16 to 25% more important than average. This is kind of that, maybe not our top tier thing that's motivating any of these groups, but it is important. It is distinctly more important than average for each of these four groups, which is encouraging to see. And that was specifically what I was referring to. Wasn't planning on going back to the data specifically this way, but right there.
Thank you. And
sorry if this is
just one final question I think we've got time for. So quite a good one here. Atopical, has the recent unrest in the US, do you think, had any impact on these segments? Do you think it will have made them even more strongly defined potentially, or impacted some more than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it's similar to what we were talking about before. Are these segments lasting? Will this change when this goes away? Now that something is a bigger, more present stressor than this was the week before, there are core motivations that you rely on that become in some ways magnified, but with a different outlook, with a different target, and in other ways different parts that may emerge. And some of these, we're talking about a new thing, so these get a little bit it becomes less top of mind as a new stressor is emerged. So I think the core of how someone is motivated and how someone reacts to things, I think is lasting and is fairly fundamental. But to the extent that the immediate present stressor, some people, depending on what that stressor is, it may exacerbate that or it may diminish that.
Thank you very much, David. Okay, we have one or two other questions, but I think we'll get back to those kind of offline. I will just like to say before we end that you can get all the information from this study today, and also the syndicated research that ViveHav has talked about. That's all available to you. ViveHav, do you want to say anything finally on the consumer research, the next steps?
So not anything new apart from what I already did. So the detail about the study is on the website. And we could probably even share that link as well. which directs people directly to it. But yeah, so it's live. It's being done across 8 different markets, and there are a few other markets which we're kind of expanding this to. And some of the interesting results have already started coming up. So feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to have a detailed discussion about it.
Okay. Thank you. Well, those links will all be sent through in a follow-up email at the end of the webinar. So thank you very much. And along with that, also a survey. So thanks to everyone for attending today. Thank you to our speakers. And details of the next set of OSG webinars will be appearing on our website as well in the very near future. So we'll be getting those up in the next week or so. So thank you very much again. All the materials from the webinar as well are available. So my contact details and anything you want to ask our speakers, just do feel free to reach out. So thank you. Thank you for attending today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.